had a bit of a maybe identity crisis is too strong a word. If Trump wins the US election, then you will see a complete shift in US policy, which will force the Ukrainians to shift. I think Putin is a war criminal who is a disastrous person for Russia.
So, how do you see this war ending? And as half Russian yourself, what are your views about modern day Russia and Putin?
I think that we would be better to designate an entire episode to this if you were interested.
Okay.
No, I mean, I'll give you an answer, but I think for your viewers and the doing justice to the importance of what that is, the topic, I think it's important. I've had a bit of a maybe identity crisis is too strong a word, but I've had a lot of internal divisions because my grandmother comes from the region in question, the Donbass or Don Cossack. But my father was born in Moscow and grew up in Siberia, so we're pretty Russian, but we do have that association with this area. Not pretending to be Ukrainian, but it shows you the interwoven and integration between these two nations historically because of imperialism, because of ethnographic divisions and locations and well, people moving and stuff, and how culture spreads and things like that. But yeah, I think that the war is going to go on. It's a protracted conflict. It doesn't change much. You watch or follow any military analysts, people who look at the day-to-day tactical movements, and you're literally talking about field by field, meter by meter, mile by mile. There's a couple of people who I don't really agree with much of their, shall we say, geopolitical or grand strategy perspectives. But on the tactical level, I look at what they're saying, but I also think it's kind of absurd that they are getting so much. For me, I just don't find it understandable why people are like, oh, they've managed to get, that they've destroyed a tank here. They've pushed towards the local village population of circa a couple thousand people. The amount of excitement and energy that was around Avdiivka a few months ago, right? That's a population of about 40,000, I think, and the Russians likely cost in injuries, in casualties, so fatalities and injured and missing and all that, right? 50,000. It's not efficient warfare. So the Russians are making progress, but not enough. But it's not like you're seeing them, take town. Not like the counteroffensive the Ukrainians did in late 2022 when they suddenly took back at lightning speed, dozens of territory around Kharkiv and basically pushed the Russians out of that oblast. Right? It hasn't changed. The lines have not moved, and the overall percentage of land controlled by the Russians is around 18%. The highest it was ever at was 22, 23%. So almost a quarter of Ukrainians' land was under Russian influence control. But then the Russians pulled out of Cherniv and the north, to the northeast and around Kiev. And then the Ukrainians took back Kharkiv. So other than that, the Russians have not made any sizable gains, but neither have the Ukrainians made any counter gains, if that's a word, right? They haven't made any sizable since then. The big lauded counteroffensive last year never materialized, and that's because, in my opinion, it was bigged up too much. They announced it way too soon or whatever. The Russians were way too more dug in. The Ukrainians didn't have all the equipment they needed, and nothing happened. So largely speaking, in the short to medium time, nothing is going to change. The only thing that will change is off the battlefield. If the Russians start, I don't know, using more extreme forms of warfare, Putin decides to shift to, a tactical nuke, which I highly doubt because the Chinese are incredibly against that. Or the Ukrainians start using F-16s and more, equipment that they don't have, and start winning in air power, because if you can control the air, you can ultimately really influence the direction of battle. So in the short to medium term, I don't think anything is going to change really very much. more just hot air rhetoric. What will change is who wins the US election. If Trump wins the US election, then you will see a complete shift in US policy, which will force the Ukrainians to shift, which will ultimately trickle down into what happens off the battlefield, i.e., probably ceasefire, new peace deal, well, attempt to force the Ukrainians to sign a peace deal, which probably would give up certainly Luhansk and Donetsk. But the question is, one of the biggest questions specifically is the partially occupied territories. So Kherson and Zaporizhia, they are, Russia controls, I think, 60% of one of them and about 45-50% of another. That's not enough to claim that they're yours and annex them. So where does the line of contact go? Who gives up what? If Russia keeps Crimea, does it give back Zaporizhia, and Ukraine is sort of now heavily securitized? It's really difficult to see. So nothing's going to happen up until the election, and then depending upon who wins that, then we'll start to see some things change. That doesn't mean the Ukrainians will stop fighting, but the likelihood that they'll be able to sustain their defense and resistive lines is demonstrably decreases, because they haven't been able to do much, because the 60 billion package from the US didn't come for 6 months, and they weren't able to push through because they just didn't have the funding, the ammunition, and so on. So if that dries up completely after the US election, then then the Russians will be able to continue to press more. And with this new deal by the North Koreans and continued support from elsewhere, it is just a waiting game for the Russians. The strategical patience is the sort of term. As to your other point about being Russia or the Russian economy, I mean, I think Putin is a war criminal who is a disastrous person for Russia. Does that mean that I sort of hate Russia? No. My father, who is very Russian, hates Putin, right? So this isn't just a Western sort of, anti-Russia, anti-Putin sort of agenda. The guy is a dictator, and whilst you can talk about, how bad Western leaders are or whatever, he is a person who has removed any and all opposition. He has clamped down on freedom of expression. You might not like Western media, for example. I'm sure some of your audience are sitting here thinking this guy's just a Western mouthpiece or something like that. But Western journalism is biased. There is propaganda, but it's, that you're going to be reading something that at least has some evidence behind it. With Russian media, there is no freedom for diversification, right? In England, we've got The Guardian, which is left-leaning. You've got The Telegraph. You've got The Financial Times, which is economics neutral, supposedly neutral in the center. In Russia, there is no variancy. It's just Interfax, TASS, Sputnik, RT, and they're all pushing the exact same lines. There's no diversification in sort of, well, if Putin did this, there's not much critical analysis. It's very much Putin is doing the right thing. The war in Russia, the war in Ukraine is a defense against Western, aggression and threat to Russia's interests and near abroad and security and so on. So for me, I would welcome someone different. I just wish that we could have a Russia that had a different leader, more than just one person since the collapse of the Soviet Union, because we've only had two people. One of them who was a drunken idiot who was, he tried hard to sort of improve relations with the West, which I welcomed, but the guy was not a good statesman. And he was replaced by someone who in the early years, we need to be wary of this guy, but maybe we can work with him. And over time, he's just become more and more extreme and willing to use military tactics to get what he wants. No one's saying that Russia has to be in the West. It doesn't have to be America's, like India, right? I very much respect India's strategical autonomy. And despite the West's like, come on, India, be an ally, India's like, no, we're gonna do things on our terms, transactional, pragmatism, and I respect that. And I think that that would be great, right? I wish Russia could be more like India, working with different countries, even if the West doesn't like it. Well, tough shit, West. That's what you got. But Putin has decided to be more and more anti. And if you look at I'll land with this last point about this, which is that if you look at how Putin has behaved in the past few years, even the Chinese have worries about it. The best example is the North Korean pact. What they signed last week is a notable example of Russia's diminishing options. And even China is not overly thrilled with this pact. Is it against sort of, Russia distancing itself from the West? No, but China doesn't want more disruption to the Korean peninsula because that's in its near abroad. It doesn't give a shit really about Ukraine and what if Russia wants to go there. It's not overly thrilled because it's disrupting the economic system, the international economic system, which China relies on. China's trade with the West is far more than Russia's. Russia accounts for 3% of Chinese trade relations. So China doesn't really want Russia and North Korea to get too comfortable with one another because they will disrupt the economic system potentially, which China doesn't want. So the point I'm making is that Putin is so far in with his anti-Western or whatever, he's so far in this position now that he's even making some other leaders who he supposedly is good mates with be rather sort of like, could you not do that preferably, sort of thing. So I think Russia's a very resilient country. There's no denying that, but they do fall on the energy a lot. And if you take that away, then you've got some concerns. Russia has a huge population problem. There's a huge economic imbalance across the country. The power is retained within a very small minority of people. And the problem is what happens after Putin? What happens to the leadership? Who is going to vie for that? How many factions are preparing or are prepared to be in the right place at the right time to take over each thing? Could you see a fragmentation because Putin is the one thing that keeps it all together, and his very, very well created, but also, still variant power structure is, you don't have the one guy. It's like Tito and Yugoslavia. I'm not saying you're going to see sort of a fragmentation because Russia's ethnically more cohesive than Yugoslavia ever was. But, Tito was the sort of leader who kept the Yugoslav Republic together. And as soon as he disappeared, you got all the factions arguing, and then you got splitting and fragmentation in the 80s and stuff. So what happens after Putin? Is Shoigu going to try to lead? Is Petrushev? So
Medvedev.
So anyway, I went on a bit there, but it's a pretty big question, and it's tough to condense it down into a simple answer.
Yeah, but your explanation was very illuminating about how this war might end and how, one man style of governing might be very detrimental to a country as large as Russia.